Angelo, welcome. This is wonderful. It's great to have you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Angelo is a physician, anesthesiologist, and a great author, and most importantly, an awake individual who woke up to a reality from his personal experience that we would like to share and hear about. I would say, like all ancient sages that we hear about who had moments of transcendence, moments of awakening, and then they actually shared it with others. And many have spent their entire life looking again for that experience and that knowledge and that awakening through different spiritual paths. So, Angelo, welcome. You've written a great book, Awake. And we'd like to see what is the difference between waking up from sleep or dream, waking up from anesthesia or from coma or vegetative state, and waking up in a real way as you have experienced it. Can you tell us about your experience, a little bit of the background and how this happened? It's fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So when I was growing up, I noticed a lot of emotional contraction, and I didn't know that as such. I didn't have the terminology, didn't even know what the process was going on inside me, but I could feel some sort of density just contracting as I was getting older, and ultimately I was taking on repressed emotions from people around me, not realizing it. And I actually had a good amount of capacity for that, I think, until I started to develop a sort of ego structure, a mental self. And as I developed that, just because our nervous systems are complex enough that that's going to happen essentially for everyone, it became very, very uncomfortable. And I didn't understand any of why this was happening until years later. But for me, it was very uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable to live in a world of thought, of the yakety yak of the mind, of the internal narrative, self-doubt, doubts about who I am, what I'm supposed to be doing, what's wrong with me. Is it, who am I? All of these thoughts that were just racing around in my mind were incredibly uncomfortable. So I was about 19 years old, I think, when I learned to meditate. And that actually was a tremendous help. It was very helpful. It offered me a period throughout the day where I could feel relaxed. For the first time in my life, I felt equanimity, peace, but it was really relegated mostly to those times when I was meditating. And I didn't overtly realize there's something more to find, but I still felt a lot of suffering, and I felt that suffering pretty intensely, especially around other people and so forth. So I wasn't really at that time a spiritual seeker. I didn't read a bunch of spiritual texts. I kind of chalked up spirituality or spiritual dogma to just another way to rearrange thoughts and beliefs to try to make yourself feel better. And that's something I could see didn't work anyway. So I think I just had a bit of a skeptical attitude toward pretty much any kind of self-help or these sorts of things. And at some point, something hit me that it's not about anything in the words. It's not about doctrine. It's not about any specific system or method. There's a very real living possibility, a living truth that's available to me. And the first time I tasted that, the first time I knew that beyond a doubt, it was interesting because it was the first time I had felt something pure in my life, something more real than this internal suffering place I'd been in for years. But I didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't know how to access it. I just sort of knew it was possible. I could feel it. I could sense it, and it was fleeting. It just went, came and went. So kind of afterwards, I was left with that feeling of like I've been to the Garden of Eden, but now I'm out of it again. And so it was even in one sense more frustrating. But it planted a seed that there was some deep, profound transformation possible. So when I was 24 years old, and we can go into however much detail you want on this, but when I was 24 years old, I actually figured it out. And I figured it out by reading a book about Zen and reading a description of an exchange between a Zen teacher and students. It's called the 3 Pillars of Zen. And by reading his instructions on how to work with a specific koan, I realized exactly what he was talking about. And it related to what I had experienced before, but it went far deeper. It was something at the level of identity. It had nothing to do with thoughts, emotions, the story, the narrative of my life. Didn't even have to do with the physicality of my life. It wasn't anything that like that. It was profound in the most fundamental sense. And I knew somehow that I could actually orient myself to this fully. And I also knew that would mean I would have to let go of everything I thought I knew about myself, not just mentally, but like energetically. And I just intuited that. Now, this happened really quickly, this part, where I have to look back on it and unpack it to even say that, because for me, it was so obviously where I wanted to go, because everything behind me was just suffering, that it was an easy decision to make. When I finally knew that it was possible to actually let go into this, then I did. And that changed everything. It changed at a very rapid pace. It changed how I experience myself, how I experience thought, how I experience the mind, how I experience space and time, literally everything. It completely fundamentally changed how I experience everything, to the degree that even using the language of I, the one that's experiencing it, was so fundamentally altered that it to even speak in those terms isn't really accurate, but we don't have other language really. So I'll just say I was sort of absorbed into to everything, but it was quite formless. So it's appearing just like this is all appearing, but it's quite formless, and I could say spacious, but it's also not. It's not in space. That's the weird thing about it. Time and space come after this, actually. They're extrapolated afterward by the mind to make sense of this 3-dimensional world to move and function in, which is practical and important. So you don't actually lose the practicality and the ability to use the mind in that way. But at the level of identity, something very real occurs, and it's a transformation that doesn't reverse. It stays that way. So that's the gist of what happened. That was when I was 24. And then since then, I would say there have definitely been refinements to it, but the fundamental shift, which was exquisitely clear, has essentially stayed. It's not a static thing either. So to say it stayed doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not an experience. It's beyond experience. But that sense of the suffering separate self never reformulated. And it's clear that it can't, actually, because it never existed. So there you go.
Wonderful. It's really great to see that experience was fundamental, in the sense that through meditation, you have experienced something and kept experiencing it for a number of years. And then suddenly there was a further layer of awakening through what we can call understanding or intellectual understanding. So the intellect also, which means our ability to understand, and usually the intellect discriminates between things. But in this case, the discrimination is between diversity and unity, and able to see that unity that you experience is at the basis of all the diversity. And that this knowledge that you have received has been fundamental also and important in consolidating the experience, it seems. And then experience and knowledge are both very important. And going through those phases of suffering or emotions and all of that is also teaching and finding, the difference between what the situation is before the realization and what the situation is after the realization is very different. Many great seekers, you spoke of spirituality and all that, many great seekers in history have had this path of not making sense of really what is happening, And if they are truly searching for an ultimate truth, an ultimate reality, they're not satisfied. So there is that longing and that sense of subcases, suffering, which kind of vanishes when the light comes. So it's like being in the darkness in a sense, where things seem to be separate, and then you get a light and things to be coherent and connected. It's a beautiful experience, and it's a wonderful awakening. And what would you suggest? What people should do? Is it two levels we have here? The personal experience that people say, well, what do I do about it? How can I get it? And then the understanding of it. And in our podcast, this is a lot of what we actually discuss. And we have names for these different levels. We can also bring them out. It's just to give them a definition and a structure. So from your feeling in the book Awakening, what do you tell people to do so that they either wake up or become awake, and in a sense, get more enlightened, if you like? It's a bigger word, but this is in the same direction. Awake is more simple because one feels that there is a contrast between being drowsy and being alert and awake. But in ancient traditions, there is terminology such as enlightened and being enlightened, which is really being fully awake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. That there are definitely stages to this. There's no doubt about that. The insight that matters, as I mentioned, is really at the level of identity. So what I would tell somebody who's interested, who can feel into what I'm saying, is interested in truly going beyond all of the conceptualities of who I think I am and so forth. I would tell them to, first of all, really sit with what your motivation is. What do you want? What is it you want, really? And the reason is sometimes we have competing agendas. I may really want to go beyond my idea of myself. Something in me knows that's the right way to go. That's the direction that my instinct is taking me. And at the same time, there's some competing agenda in my life. I also want to have safety. I also want to have financial security. I want to have a great relationship, and all that's fine. But if you're not aware of competing agendas, then they often trip you up. You get you mix things together and kind of try to use this technique to work toward this and vice versa. So when you see those things clearly, you realize there are practical means to attain all of these aspects of life that are important to us. There's tools, there's coaches, and all of it for relationships and vocation and all of it. When it comes to what I'm talking about, it's really important to see that the tools that you use for other means in life really don't work for this, mostly because it's really about you. It's not about a specific guru or teaching. It's about you. It's a very, very intimate process, and it's a process of turning toward and going inward one way or another, letting go into that deep, deep instinct that there is somewhere to go beyond my conceptual self, beyond my narrative of who I think I am, where I'm going, all of it. So the first part of it is really just attuning to your instinct and learning to trust yourself, that it's okay to go there, that often society has not told you to go there. It's told you to go outward and seek surrogates for happiness and so forth. But giving yourself permission is key, that you are willing to really turn inward and let go into something more true, more real than you've taken to be reality. That's number one. Number two, I would say that for me, the contrast was between meditation and not necessarily knowledge, because it wasn't something I learned, but the contrast was between meditation or augmented by meditation and a sort of inquiry. It's really a questioning, and the questioning is key in how you ask and with what spirit you ask, and that you ask with a certain kind of openness. Openness meaning you have to realize you have your own limitations, and your mind limits you a lot. Your cognitive apparatus, not your infinite mind or anything, but the cognitive apparatus does limit you a lot. So being willing to open yourself up to something beyond the dimensions of what you take yourself to be is really key with inquiry. That it really has to be an open-ended type of question and a type of investigation. And that can play out a lot of ways. It can be, who am I? And then just trying to turn back toward and rest in that sense of I, that pure sense of I before I become anything, before I learned that I was a person, a man, a woman, a physician, anything. So who am I? And just letting go of any thoughts about who I am and getting right back to that root of the pure sense of I and resting in that. That's one way. In my book, I describe a way to approach this through thought and realizing that any thought that arises spontaneously in the mind is a sort of, it sort of has built-in limitations, meaning if I believe I am this, I automatically believe I'm not everything else. And that sounds innocuous or innocent with one single thought, and it is. But, with thousands and thousands of thoughts a day, we actually end up in this continuum of thought. And we don't realize we're really confining our identity into this very small space. So by noticing one thought at a time and recognizing, oh, that's one thought. I'm a good person. That's a thought. I'm a bad person. That's a thought. I'm a spiritual person. There's another thought. And as you disregard those thoughts, you start to recognize the source of thought, essentially, or that in which thoughts arise and dissipate, which is consciousness. Just noticing that is helpful, but that's not the shift. The shift is ultimately when the experience of being an I, in the way I had taken myself to be previously, is seen itself to be only a thought. And to experience consciousness as all there is in this space is a huge release. Typically, it's a release from years of pent up tension, and you have emotions that you didn't even know you were repressing, and they just disappear and just sublimate, and it's quite a shift often. So a form of inquiry is usually key, and it takes a lot of different forms. And in my chapter in the book, I describe how to find your own natural question, to give yourself permission to ask the most fundamental questions, the questions that matter to you. Why do I suffer? Who am I taking myself to be? And is there something more primary than that operating right here? Is there something here when there's thoughts and when there's no thoughts? Completely unchanged. Those kinds of fundamental questions, finding the one that interests you and resonates with you, I find is what really works for people.
Wonderful. And the first part of what you described, you used often, a few times, either directly going beyond or indirectly letting go, and meaning letting go of what is the usual, what is the surface level, towards something inwards. And in other words, this is what we call transcendence. To transcend is a term that means to go beyond. And this is the technique, actually, we teach, the transcendental meditation, which is exactly like that, to go beyond and to go inward and to let go, which is what gets us there. And then to understand also what is there. It's, the second part in terms of inquiry, which means asking questions. And asking questions requires answers. And the answers are what I generally put under the category of understanding or knowledge. Not that knowledge in terms of specific values, but to understand what your experience is. Because when one experiences a field of consciousness that is beyond, that is completely settled, as we do in transcendental meditation, when we go beyond the surface and go to pure consciousness and realize that, some people just think it's void, it's emptiness. And we have many experiences of people where at the beginning, they feel like falling into void or falling into nothingness. And yet you point to them that they are conscious, they are still conscious, that there is nothingness, as if nothingness, but its consciousness is still there. It's not like the unconscious of deep anesthesia or coma or even to some extent sleep, because there is awakening and there is wakefulness with nothingness specific. And that's what going beyond is. And this is where knowledge or inquiry and answer to the inquiry, understanding what one is going through, helps also in figuring out what is going on, because there is the experience and then there is, let's say, the inquiry, because you like to have more emphasis on that, about what is this experience? How do I fit it? Where do I fit it in my reality? And then one can then have another layer of understanding, of awakening, on even the level of intellectual analysis. But what is also important, I feel you are maybe directly or indirectly mentioning, is that just experience, or not just experience, just knowledge by itself or theory is not enough to make the shift. There is something that one has to touch, but not touch on the physical level, but touch directly within oneself and know it to be real. How important for you was one or the other in terms of how much intellectual analysis, understanding, and versus actually directly transcending made a difference? Because you started off, obviously, with years of meditation and therefore somehow transcending again, and then got to that platform of having that sense of oneness that grew in your life.
Yeah. So for me, it really wasn't about understanding or knowledge for me. For me, it was actually the initial shift was really about transcending knowledge ultimately, but because the sense of self, the sense of the cognitive self is structured in knowledge. It's structured in consciousness. And so for me, it really was about actually letting go of that and seeing that the thought system that had bound me, that was causing all the anxiety and frustration and struggle, that was not me. That wasn't me. So really for me, it was a matter of surrender, or dropping out of that binding of knowledge and information. Now, beyond that, as realization deepens, there can be value to understanding some of the ways that the perceptual filters fall away. And there are, as I said, there are sort of stages to this, but things get very subtle. So I caution people, to really trust their immediate and direct experience more than thoughts or knowledge or beliefs or doctrine at all, because it gets very sticky. We use it as a life preserver because we really do find ourselves falling into this vastness that is can be quite daunting. It feels good at first. When you first taste oneness, it feels good as an experience. When you dissolve into oneness, it can be quite something else. And so I always feel, as I did in my book, that I feel responsible to tell people ahead of time that this process I'm talking about, you will experience a fear barrier. You will experience emotions that will surprise you. And you're prepared for it if you know that they're coming. You may not be fully prepared, but you're not totally surprised and think something went off the rails. You realize, oh, this is actually supposed to happen. But when you transcend identity in a very real way, your ego doesn't take that lying down. The alarm bells start to go off, and so that is part of it. And I can't deny the fact that that's part of it. But some of that knowledge, having lived this way for many years, helped for me to prepare other people for it, to put it into terminology that helps smooth the process for people who are wanting to go through this or already going through it, whether they like it or not. People do just find themselves spontaneously opening this way. So there is a value to knowledge later on, but it has to be really clear that the knowledge is not used to continue to structure a cognitive self, a separate self, because a cognitive self will always feel separate. You could say that there's a vast sort of self underneath that. And that's a big shift into that stage of realization. It does even go beyond that, but that this vastness of self that is unbound by any thoughts or beliefs, or, like I said, time or space, or anything you've ever thought in the mind, doesn't actually touch this. It's that spacious and fluid.
Yeah, beautiful. Yes, knowledge can also be dogmatic in a sense, or become dogmatic if it doesn't have some kind of connection with experience by itself, because this is how science actually started to reject even ancient wisdom and knowledge to some extent at the beginning, because there were so many philosophies, ways of thinking, as you said, guidelines and dogmas and all of that. And ultimately, science said, okay, let's examine what works, what doesn't work. But there are many contradictory ideas about the sense of what ultimate reality is, because this is what we're talking about really here, is what is the ultimate reality that is the foundation of all the differences, because differences exist on the surface level, but there is something that binds them, that glues them, or actually something that makes them, because if we think they are bound, as if it's parts that then can appear as a whole. But here what we're talking about is the wholeness appearing as parts in different ways. And so this is quite a complex thing to accept, because people's identities are so entrenched in their nationality and their beliefs and their looks and their habits and their job and their relations with others. And so we form a sense of self that is based on specific values. And if you try to tell somebody that there is more than that, that you are not that, you are something else at the basis of all of that, they first will not really fully grasp it. And then this is where experience is primary. And it's beautiful that you highlighted this way also, of course, that let's leave knowledge apart. Let's not feel, bound by specifics, either specific sense of self or not, and try to see what there is deeper than that. And then when the experience dawns, then the reality dawns, that I am more than just that. We had beautiful people, even in our teaching of transcendental meditation, that many, like, for example, even if we want to take an extreme cases of criminal situations in prisons or for rehabilitation, where people have a sense of themselves as being a criminal, as being somebody who is wrong, and they identify with this, and they say, this is who I am, what can I do? And they do the things, which is mind-boggling, because we think everybody wants to assume they are good people and nice people. Mm-hmm. But there are actually these people who find themselves in a situation where they identify with something that is, in a sense, not good, not good at all even. And then when they transcend, they discover something. And I remember some of them, and particularly one that comes to mind, who said, I could never believe that there is something in me that is so deep and so quiet and so silent and so peaceful. I was identifying myself with something that is violent, that is outwardly trying to do things. And now I discover there is something in me that is so profound. And this person's life changed, and, they got released. They never had to go back to prison. And so what we're talking about is very practical. It's very practical. At the same time, it needs a way to let go. And I really feel Angelo's Awake book helps in opening the awareness to that. And this is why we teach this technology of consciousness, we call it, that helps to transcend in a very systematic way, because experience is primary. And then later we can ask and understand. So just to go into some words here, because we have in a way structured it and we need some words to understand it. There is something which is transcending. And now we're talking to an anesthesiologist who deals with putting people to sleep and now wants to awaken people. And in states of consciousness, we have sleep, dream, and waking as states of consciousness. But we have a new state of consciousness, which we're talking about right now. And that is a transcendental state of consciousness, we call it. And that is a state that has, like sleep, dream, and waking, its own physiology, its own chemistry and electrophysiology of the brain, can be studied physically, physiologically, and by EEG and different structures that are showing that there is a different state of restful alertness or wakeful restfulness, if you like, and that we call transcendental consciousness, a state of transcending. Now, if this state remains with you, this is when we hear Angelo describing how his experience progressed into a sense of inner peace, quiet continuity of experience of being. And, there are, and he says it's there, sometimes not there, it comes back, but the reference is there, the connection is there. And when actually it is always there, we even call it cosmic consciousness. I'm saying this because many of our listeners are already experiencing and know this kind of aspect of their life. And just putting it in a terminology, cosmic consciousness sounds like a big thing, but it is the sense of that inner self always being there, never lost. So the sense of who I am is infinite, unbounded, pure, call it pure consciousness. At the same time, we are still active and productive in the outside. And this is one thing I wanted to ask you, and that is the importance of relating to others, working in the world, and being dynamic in the world. And you alluded to this in what we're discussing, that it's not a state of becoming lethargic or withdrawing from the world, but just a state of awakening. Do you want to elaborate a little more on that, on the outer and the inner?
Yeah, so what you're describing as cosmic consciousness is the background. It's always here. And so the experience of unbound, I just call it unbound consciousness. There's no structuring in consciousness of a personal narrative or of a world separate from anything. It's just basically pure consciousness. So that's here 24/7, and it doesn't come and go at all. But that's one. It's hard to talk about this because it goes deeper than this. That's one aspect of experience. But from that, there's a beautiful unbinding that happens all the time, meaning unbinding from any history or personal narrative, such that the availability of response, of love, of interconnection with others is always, pretty much always there. It's reasonably seamless. So there's not a sense of hesitating, holding back from life. There's not a sense of wanting not to be here, or feeling numb, or out of it, or wanting to just run away and meditate. That's not the case at all, because the meditation's always happening. You could say at some point, meditation doesn't end. There's something here that's always meditating. And so that, from that experience for me, that makes it feel as if there's a sort of infinite availability of freedom, of creativity, if that makes sense. Now, there's always relative constraints. That no person becomes a god or anything like that. It's not, that would be a misperception. But based on the conditions that this body mind exists in, the blockages of self-doubt and mind identification and being lost in thought, those blockages can completely clear. And there's just this background of that consciousness you're describing, and it's there all the time. And so it's a very simple, direct, innocent, and enjoyable way to live. And there's no pretense to it. That's the other beautiful thing about it. It's just simple.
Beautiful. It's the simplest thing, actually. Everything else is pretense.
Yeah.
Because if the reality is one, then pretending to be something else is actually the mistake.
Mhm.
And so by surrendering, you also use that term to the self in a very systematic way, and establishing that self and the reality of unbounded consciousness or cosmic consciousness. That reality is a continuum that allows you to be active and dynamic and creative on the outside also. It's not a separation or a withdrawal from life and living and enjoying actually life. The teacher who brought this technology of consciousness, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, used to take an example, and that is, why would one want to act? Why should one be acting if one is established in that fulfillment? And he takes a very simple example. He says, if you are sitting in a warm bath and there is warmth around you, but you don't move, at one point, the equilibrium of that makes you feel like it's just a continuous state, which is great. But if you start moving, then the waves of warmth create a greater joy and greater bubbles of fulfillment, which give a different experience. So established in that self, acting within the outside is going to create all kinds of waves of happiness and joy. So this sense of having to do a life which is withdrawn, and people have misunderstood even the knowledge and importance of transcending as being something which withdraws and goes away. Although we do it just during moments at the beginning when we are meditating, but then when this is established, it's the outward that is happening. So a few minutes of inward and a lot of minutes outward makes the outward more fulfilling. And then when one comes to that unbounded consciousness or cosmic consciousness, then there is further realization. And that is where we can take it to another level. And that is, how do you see others? See, first we see yourself as unbounded consciousness. And then now it transcends even just the self of being unbounded. I am everything. To realize that everyone is everything. So there is that first self-realization, and then it grows to spontaneously, because this is the one thing, grows spontaneously to embrace others as also being myself. And this is a higher, if you like, layer, although they can grow, of course, together, a higher layer of what we can call unity consciousness, unity awareness. You'd like to say anything about that in your experience and your thoughts?
Yeah. So it's I wouldn't necessarily use the same terminology, but that is very clear. So the experience of another, the experience of otherness, the experience even of physical objects. There's not a way to say that that's over there and I'm over here. So this is when realization moves beyond, as you said, a personal experience of just say unbound consciousness that's continuous, to this experience where the physical world actually change. It doesn't change. You see it in a more fundamental way, such that the knowingness that I am this, or this consciousness, or this anything, and the knowingness that is that over there drops away, and it's as if you experience yourself in more than one place at once. So if I look at an object, I can see that the mind is making that into an object over there for practical means, and yet the identity at the identity level, it's a perception of radical intimacy. I'm here and there at the same time. That's the best way I can say it. So myself and otherness don't make sense anymore. And again, the language doesn't work for this, so it's not like I walk around talking about this, but when that shifts, it's very obvious.
Beautiful. We can call it, just as the sense, of course, of categorizing. We can call it unity in the sense that there is no more separation. That even though you see the apple, you see the flower, you know that they are ultimately the one unbounded consciousness of pure being, pure consciousness, appearing and manifesting in a phenomenal way as different values, as some other aspect of reality. What is interesting is in physics, also going deeper into the nature of ultimate reality, they have come to different fields rather than just objects, but actually electromagnetic field, gravitational field. And most scientists believe that there is ultimately one field, a unified field, which is the source of all the other fields. It's like we used to think that electricity and magnetism are two things. And now we, of course, know very clearly, and Nobel Prizes have been given for unification, that it's in one field. It's the electromagnetic field that appears if it's in a rotational way or something magnetic, if it's a linear way or other ways, it's electric. And we have now more unification with the weak force and trying to unify the strong force and even the gravitational force. And there are theories about that. So what is being discussed is not just some fanciful feeling that Angelo experienced, I experience, or other who practice transcendental meditation other ways also experience it. But it's something that also connects with how the physical understanding of reality takes us into a unified field that for all practical purposes is actually a field of consciousness, a field of awareness. And therefore we are not creating another belief system that has no connection to empiricism or experience and reality, but it is truly also how ultimate objectivity, which means the ultimate way to study the object, finds ultimate subjectivity, which is the subject finding themselves in a unified state. And then even from the objective level, they have matched and they match. And also the effects on this, the disappearance of anxiety, disappearance of fear, disappearance of sense of separation. So it has many practical benefits, even for health, for well-being, and for society as a whole. So there are so many converging logics and factors and understandings and experiments that actually say that this is the true reality, not just a one person's awakening, but that awakening is significant and can be had by everyone, because that is the ultimate reality.
Yeah, it correlates very well. I love reading about quantum field theory, relativity. It's fascinating, and it jives very clearly with my direct experience.
Did it at all help you in your kind of coming to a conclusion, or it's just an additional value?
I think it's just additional. It feels so intimate to read about light, for instance, and the special theory of relativity essentially saying a beam of light does not experience time or space because it's length contracted and time dilated to infinity. So a beam of light experiences the beginning and end of the universe at the same time, one particle of light. And then you start to understand what the word enlightenment actually means, that it's an experience of that infinite nature of light directly. And the quantum field theory, very, very much so. And quantum entanglement, all of it. It just really vibes with my experience.
Beautiful, beautiful. And what do you want to do about it now that you have a book and you're inspiring people and guiding them? You're still in anesthesia as a medical doctor?
Yeah, I still work full-time as an anesthesiologist. I do make videos. I just try to facilitate this for anyone who's interested and just offer different resources and, just encourage people ultimately that, there are so many ways now. There's transcendental meditation, there are different forms of inquiry, there's body-based practices, and combinations of these really help people if they're interested in really turning toward the inner truth of who and what they are and going very deep. So I really just try to encourage that in any way I can, and talk to whoever wants to have a discussion about it.
It's wonderful, because it brings profoundly the understanding of the self from this little body that is limited by the skin, to growing not only to one's family, to one's society, even to one's nation, but also to one's world and one's universe, and including the environment. And today we have many, many big questions that we ask about resolution of big problems, about the environment, about war that we are facing, because we're speaking here about some experience, and people are saying, but what about all these issues that we are encountering, environment, about war, and all of that. And this experience, even though apparently a personal, intimate experience, actually can give a solution to our problems. Because if you consider the environment as yourself, and you're a responsible person in society, then you will behave towards it in a different way. If you consider this world as yourself also, then you will not be inclined to start a war or a conflict, but to actually embrace and be together and be in unity with yourself. And so this has huge implications in our worldview, which is very important for how we will solve problems. Environment, for example, we know exactly what needs to be done. We know exactly what needs to be done. Why is it not done? Why? Because there is me and there is you, and there are this and that. And if you progress maybe economically while I am saving the environment, then it's a threat on my survival and a threat on me. And so therefore, I can't do these things that help the environment when you are doing something else, or profiting from so many things. And this is a source of conflict, the source of problems, a source of discontent and fear from the other. And if one is starting to realize this oneness in a profound way and a real way, not only on the individual level, but also on the collective level, which means many individuals rising to that understanding, then the society itself rises to that understanding, and the leaders rising to that understanding. And then the solutions truly come from that basis of unity. Whereas in separation, there is always fear of the other and decision-making that is not in tune with the reality of life, which is oneness. Do you want to say anything about this?
You said it very well. I completely agree. Yeah. I mean, there's so many benefits. If you think of how conflicts start, major conflicts that cost many lives, and wars and so forth, that cost financial cost, personal cost, they start with disagreements. They start with a misperception in one person's mind because they feel divided on the inside. They feel attacked when they're not. They feel separate from everything. If that one person were to realize this sort of unity consciousness as you're describing, maybe they wouldn't have done that, or maybe in the next iteration of that conversation, they wouldn't feel so triggered that they need to take some huge action, and instead just say, well, maybe I'm misinterpreting. Maybe it's just okay. Maybe it's okay. So I can think of so many ways that this is hugely beneficial to people at all levels. But as you mentioned at the beginning, the personal, someone quoted once many years ago to me that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi used the phrase, A green forest is made up of individual green trees. So you can be a green tree. You can't force the forest to be green, but you can be a green tree. And if enough people become green trees, enough people become calmer, connected with truth, with themselves, with everything, it does have an effect. I think it really does have a ripple effect. And then certain people in key situations where a conflict could arise or not arise based on how clear they are, how at peace they feel, that can have huge implications. So of course, this is very important work, the most important work. And we need it to save us at this point. As you said, we know what to do. We know what's needed in many of the issues we're facing. We know.
You just need to do it.
Yeah, it's about doing it, but a lot of it's just about getting on the same page,
Right,
working together, not thinking so in terms of, nationalism and self and other and all that.
Beautiful. And actually, we have done research on that. It's, again, because people say, well, is it a nice idea or just something that is left to, to science, or has it been checked and all of that? And we have done, there are 50 different scientific research studies that show that people, when they transcend, and they transcend particularly specifically in groups and together, then there are changes in society. And it has been documented repeatedly. There is a wonderful new research which follows the number of people transcending, so going back to the self, so doing what you are suggesting they should do. In our case, it's transcendental meditation, which we find is the direct way, but people can have their own ways, whatever. They actually see that with the number of people practicing this program together, there is change in conflict, accidents of the road, and many other factors, violent crime, you mentioned it, robberies, rape, etc. They are actually systematically reduced in a very significant way, an important way, and with a big effect, big group effect, based on the numbers. So as the numbers increase of those who practice these technologies, we can see the very striking change in all of these factors of violence, of crime, of conflict, etc. And as the groups dismantle, we can see, unfortunately, returning back to baseline and even continuing to rise as they were being projected from before these groups were practicing. So again, it's truly based on experience. So we encourage everyone to experience the self as being unbounded, to be guided by great wisdom that is presented to us in the Awake book, and the knowledge that is shared from personal experience, plus all the scientific support of it, the documented evidence-based research that has shown the effectiveness for individual and society, as well as the understanding that we touched on from physics, from understanding how the world is, what is ultimate reality. So it's a real thing, and to wake up to what is real is important. Otherwise, we are living in that which is not real, and that is what we call darkness or ignorance. And to live in ignorance is bound to lead us to something which is not as progressive, as happy, as evolutionary, as growing, allowing growth and transformation in the best direction for the benefit of every individual and society. Thank you very much. Wonderful to have you. Please, if you have something to add or to say before we close, I'd like to welcome you to say that.
Well, thank you for having me. I would just say to anyone watching, if you feel that inclination to turn inward, to really address the fundamental questions, the question of identity, the question of consciousness, the question of unity, you have every right to do it. And there are means, there are all kinds of means, but ultimately it's really on you to do that. And it's very much worth it. So I wish anyone who is interested in that fruition.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Great to have you. Looking forward to meeting you in person.
Very nice. Nice to meet you.